Hello everybody, today's lesson will cover the Middle Ages in Western Europe. The Middle Ages spanned approximately from 500 AD to 1500 AD. It is considered to be the middle of three major historical periods in Western history, between the Classical and Modern eras as shown on the timeline. The Middle Ages began with the fall of Rome in 476 and culminated with the Renaissance, which ended around 1500. This era is basically a span of time between two eras of centralized power in Western Europe. The Middle Ages can be separated into two sections, the first half being the Dark Ages, spanning from 500 to 1000, and secondly the High Middle Ages, between 1000 and 1500. Dark Ages is an appropriate name for the first half of the Middle Ages, given the decline in Western Europe's infrastructure, intellectual pursuits, and societal organization. The barbarian invasions of Rome in the late 400s and the end of the Roman Empire in Western Europe is the key event that caused this decline in society. The lack of a central power led to Western Europe's population becoming isolated and virtually stopped the flow of ideas and goods throughout the continent. The final century of the Dark Ages would begin the slow growth of towns, cities, agriculture, and trade as the Catholic Church and feudal system provide a level of security and stability that had been lacking since the fall of Rome. The High Middle Ages saw the continued growth of Western Europe's population and centralization of power. The Church takes a more secular role in the life and governance of Europe's people during this period, later becoming corrupt. The rise of monarchies also play a substantial role in the organization of society and the formation of national identities in modern nation-states. Key events such as the Crusades, Black Death, and Hundred Years' War and their effect on Western Europe will be addressed later in the lesson. The High Middle Ages culminated in the Renaissance, which fostered the rebirth of arts and intellect in Western Europe, putting the region into a new historical era. As mentioned earlier, the fall of Rome in 476 really marks the start of Western Europe's decline. The Roman Empire remained intact in Eastern Europe, with its capital at Constantinople, which is in modern-day Turkey. That being said, its collapse in the West caused a power vacuum that contributed to the isolation and decline of society. At its height, the Roman Empire controlled almost all of Europe and the Mediterranean world, stretching from Britain to northern Africa and from the Iberian Peninsula to modern-day Turkey and Egypt. It was one of the most advanced societies up to this point in time and had one of the first forms of democratic government. Stability under the Romans allowed for technologies such as improved roads, bridges, aqueducts, coin money, and defensible cities to spread across Europe. After its collapse in the West, though, Roman infrastructure either crumbled or was pillaged. In these two maps, we can see the decline of the Roman Empire to the east over less than a century. The map on the left shows the empire at 395 AD, with the red line indicating its boundaries. On the map to the right, the westernmost part of the remaining Roman Empire stretches only to modern Greece. Western Europe is split between various areas of barbarian control, notably the Visigoths in modern Spain and southwestern France, the Franks in modern Belgium, Luxembourg, Netherlands, and a portion of western Germany, the Vandals in northern Africa, and the Kingdom of Odoacer over the Italian peninsula. With no central government to structure society, peoples in Western Europe organize themselves around a landholder for mutual benefit. Feudalism is the term for this organization, which describes the relationship between a landholding lord and a vassal, or member of the warrior class. A lord would offer a piece of land called a fief to a vassal in exchange for their loyalty and service. This system would eventually develop into knighthood and a professional warrior class. Manorialism is a similar system to feudalism. Since the use of coin money had become quite rare, a system of labor exchange was used instead. As with feudalism, power was vested to a lord who allowed peasants to work the land in exchange for a cut of their produce. Feudalism and manorialism both contributed greatly to the restructuring and stability of Europe by providing defense and an economic system to operate within. Improvements in agriculture between 800 and 1000 were essential for Western Europe's return to an advanced society. The use of horses instead of oxen to pull machinery gave medieval farmers increased productivity due to their speed and ability to respond to voice commands, no longer requiring a guide which is needed for oxen. To make use of horses, the horse collar was needed to connect farm implements to horses, since they lacked the wide shoulders oxen had, while horseshoes were able to give a better grip. The heavy-wheeled plow and tandem harnessing, which two horses or oxen used, vastly improved the speed at which work could be done. Since machinery was expensive, a community would pool its resources and share. Other innovations such as crop rotation and the use of nitrogen-restoring crops allowed for greater longevity of soil and shorter fallow periods on fields. Increased agricultural productivity allowed for Western Europe's population to grow. The feudal and manorial systems centralized and gave security to this growing population, giving rise to towns and cities. Eventually, as less people were needed to farm, small-scale manufacturing became possible. As coin money was extremely rare, the barter system was the norm for acquiring goods. Manufacturing and the growth of cities allowed for growth in trade and communication between populations. The Catholic Church was an important unifier throughout the Middle Ages. It was especially important to the preservation of written word in monasteries. Since few people were able to read and write, bishops, who were usually literate, commonly occupied roles of power outside of the church as well as within. As time passed, though, the church's role in medieval people's lives increased. Salvation was only offered through the church, and those who disobeyed risked being excommunicated or shunned from the church. Indulgences were abused by the church, which would exchange forgiveness for money. Corruption and the suppression of scientific ideas that challenged the teachings of the church eventually would split the church in the 1500s. The Crusades were a series of pilgrimage and wars called for by the Church to defend the Holy Land from Muslim expansion. Leaders of the Byzantine Empire appealed to the Catholic Church to help restore various holy sites in Jerusalem for Christian use. Tensions between Christians and Muslims had been growing as Islam spread from the Middle East west through northern Africa. There were 4 major crusades over a 200-year period, the first of which was called by Pope Urban II in 1096. Those who fought were offered opportunities for glory and wealth, as well as their religious service. The Crusades were important as they brought knowledge and technology from the Eastern Roman Empire that was much more advanced than the West. Disease had previously been contained to small areas since most of Western Europe's populations were relatively isolated. The return of trade and communication to the continent led to increased exposure of increasingly diverse groups of people and the introduction of new diseases. The cause of the Black Death has been traced to rats and fleas. Fleas' stomachs would become infected by a bacteria which was spread to the rats' bloodstream when they were bitten. As rats died out, fleas began biting humans, spreading the plague to them. It began in southern Europe in 1347 and worked its way north, affecting an area for about a year. It finally came to an end in Scandinavia in late 1351. The Black Death ravaged Europe, killing approximately 1/3 of its population in less than 5 years. Its horror had a profound effect on society beyond the human loss, which diminished the faith in the church as they had been unable to stop it. The 100 Years' War was fought between France and England over the control of lands within the French kingdom. Conflict also ensued over England's Edward III's potential to inherit both the English and French thrones through his French mother. Both the idea of English land holdings and an English heir were intolerable for the French. French nobles decided that Edward III could not inherit the throne through his mother. In 1331, Edward repealed his claim to the throne, but fighting would still break out over the valuable English-held lands. Although the English had an early upper hand, the cost of maintaining their army eventually became too great. see the English losses in these two maps, their territory indicated by the dark purple shade. By 1470, French territory in the light pink becomes much more recognizable to its modern boundaries. Despite the English loss of territories, the military technology created during the Hundred Years' War allowed for the French and English to become the dominant powers in Europe. As seen in the Hundred Years' War, monarchical power was well established. Monarchies arose from the feudal system as lords gained control of more and more lands. Up to this point, monarchs were for the most part submissive to the Pope, who was the head of the Church. However, through the help of secular-minded clergy, monarchs took control of local and national churches. They also gained the power of taxation over their peoples as the use of coin money returned. In addition to religious influence, the advent of professional soldiers from various civil wars allowed for kingdoms' borders to be protected. Conflicts such as the Hundred Years' Wars forged a sense of national identity and unity outside of the Church. The works and ideas of well-known men like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Machiavelli, and Isaac Newton all came out of the Renaissance. The Renaissance was a period of rapid artistic, scientific, and philosophical advancement that took place approximately between 1300 and 1500. Its significance cannot be downplayed as the age of exploration, the Reformation, and scientific revolution that propelled Europe into the modern age were all started during the Renaissance. An important factor to the return of intellectualism to Western Europe was the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire and Constantinople to the Muslim Turks in 1453. The migration of classical Greek scholars to the West returned concepts and ideas to Western Europe that had not been seen since the Romans were in power. During the Dark Ages, scholarly work was mostly confined and funded by the Church. Renaissance concepts such as humanism and other scientific advances were seen as a threat to the Church, and it offered an alternative view and explanation of the workings of the world that had been repressed for centuries. So, to put this all together, we can conclude that the Middle Ages were primarily a transition period. Following a halt in intellectual, economic, and artistic activity between 500 and 1000, Western Europe made a slow return to a sophisticated, centralized society, climaxing in the Renaissance in 1500. This return paved the way for movements like the Enlightenment, Reformation, Age of Exploration, and Scientific Revolution, and the formation of the modern nation-state.